This week's lectures are on Chapter 7, Interpersonal Communication. Today we're going to talk through, first of all, you're reading Chapter 7. Make sure that you are doing it. It is useful, helpful, and it is going to cover things that I don't cover in this lecture. I say that every week. That's because every week the reading covers things that I'm not going to cover in this lecture. We're going to focus on that definition of interpersonal communication. We're going to talk about relational messages and metacommunication in communication. And then we'll spend a good amount of time talking about self-disclosure, which is going to make up a lot of our interpersonal communication. Think about a lot of this stuff in relationship to identity management that we talked about earlier in the unit. And then if you're doing something with identity management and disclosure for your Me as a Communicator assignment, keep these things in mind. So the definition of interpersonal communication is complicated. And a lot of people think interpersonal communication is just talking with another person or talking with a group of people. And yeah, interpersonal, cool. But communication scholars have a very specific definition of interpersonal communication. And the rest of the lecture is going to hinge on this slide right here, which is my way of telling you this is important. I'm going to go through the definition and then we'll break it down. Interpersonal communication, two-way interactions between people who are part of a close and irreplaceable relationship in which they treat each other as unique individuals. First of all, two-way. That means that there are two people involved in interpersonal communication. You can see elements of interpersonal communication in other scenarios. But to be truly interpersonal, we need two. People who are part of a close and irreplaceable relationship. You can't have an interpersonal interaction with the barista who makes your latte. You come in, you order your latte, you pick up your latte. That's really all there is to it. And trust me, the drive-thru coffee shop knows my car at this point, but I don't have an interpersonal relationship with those baristas. Finally, you have to treat each other as unique individuals. So you are not the same person. You're not replaceable in an interpersonal relationship. You're unique. You treat each other specially. You really know who that other person is. You understand a lot about them, and they understand a lot about you. Interpersonal communication needs to have that two-way interaction. So it's it can't just be you understanding a lot about another person or them understanding a lot about you. You have to know each other and co-create that relationship. Remember that identity management's co-created? Heyo, here we are again. At the beginning of the semester, we talked about different communication contexts. So interpersonal, group, organizational, that kind of thing. We talked about dyadic and interpersonal, and I said, hey, we're going to come back to this interpersonal definition. Well, here we are. I want to emphasize the difference between dyadic communication and interpersonal communication. Dyadic communication is simply two people. When I go through the drive-thru coffee shop and I order my skinny vanilla latte and my large coffee with cream, I have a dyadic communication with that person. They take my order, they go make my coffee. Then I pay them some money. I have coffee. Yay! That's dyadic communication. Interpersonal requires that close and irreplaceable relationship, and that treatment as unique individuals. If you're not quite getting it, that's okay. It's a weird distinction to make sometimes. We'll go through some examples on the next slide. I'll be honest with you. When I first heard this definition of interpersonal communication, when I was an undergraduate or a graduate student, I really struggled with it. What this slide is a bunch of situations, and I'm going to ask you to determine if these situations are interpersonal or not. So take a moment, read through these, write down yes no, or maybe. And then on the next slide, I will tell you my analysis of these situations, whether they're interpersonal or not. And hopefully that'll help make that definition more clear to you. I'll give you some time to think about all of these. Don't skip ahead. Take some time. Think about these examples. All right, our first one, you go on a Tinder date, not interpersonal. Look, I have no opposition to the Tinder date. That would be hypocritical of me. But going on a Tinder date or any other date that you meet from a person online is not going to be interpersonal communication, especially for those first couple of dates. You're getting to know each other. You don't have a close and irreplaceable relationship. And in fact, on those first few dates, that person is pretty replaceable. Swipe, swipe, swipe. Tinder date, not yet an interpersonal relationship. Next one, a group of 3 friends regularly hang out as a triad. Here's a problem. 3, interpersonal communication requires 2. You can have interpersonal relationships with each of those people in the triad, but you together might not be, the 3 of you together are not going to be an interpersonal relationship because there's 3. Relationship with your roommate. Maybe. This depends on how well you know your roommate. I have a couple of friends from college who got paired together as freshman roommates, and they stayed roommates for the 4 years of college. They're great friends. They were the matron of honor in each other's weddings. Super important to each other. Those 2 had an interpersonal relationship. They became best friends as roommates. However, some of you might be experiencing this right now, where you're just kind of stuck with a rando or somebody you found on Craigslist. That person as a roommate isn't going to be necessarily an interpersonal relationship. You might have other people move in and out of the apartment or into your dorm room or out. You just might not be very close with that person, and that's totally fine. Relationship with a therapist? No. So some of you might be thinking, well, this should definitely be an interpersonal relationship. Like, why wouldn't this be? Because an interpersonal relationship needs to be 2 ways. And if you are in therapy having a 2-way relationship with your therapist, that's not a great situation. You're there to talk through your issues and your things, not listen to their problems as well. And the therapist can be replaced. If you have one that you're not clicking with or they leave the practice, you replace that person with another one. Similarly, they see lots of clients, lots of patients, not saying that you're not special and unique to them, but if you leave, somebody else can take your slot. Not an interpersonal relationship. Relationship with the clergy. Kind of the same thing. Clergy, and I'm using about the most generic term I can. I want this to apply to any religion that you might practice. Clergy can move between different institutions, so they're a little bit replaceable. You can replace them if you don't like them. You can go to a different church, synagogue, etc. Or, and then this is very similar to the therapist, where you're not going to have that 2-way disclosure with a person who's a clergy in your religious group. You might have a friend who's in the clergy. That's totally fine. Like, that's a different deal, but that person isn't going to have a 2-way disclosure with you, most likely. Relationship with a faculty member. This is kind of a maybe. So in a class like this, where you're not taking a class in your major, it's a required class, we're not going to have an interpersonal relationship. In some areas, we might get close, like we might do a little bit more self-disclosure as the semester goes on, get more comfortable with each other, but it's not an irreplaceable relationship. So I hate to tell you this, but next semester, there's going to be a whole new crop of students who sign up to take Comms 100 with me. You've moved on to other classes, I get a new crop. Every semester it happens. And I'm replaceable as well. I've had students who transfer out of my class and into another Comms 100 class because that class meets their schedule better. Not a problem. Like, I can be replaced. You are replaced every semester. Not an interpersonal relationship for this class. But if you're taking classes in your major and you develop a strong relationship with that faculty member, that can move into an interpersonal relationship. But it's probably not going to be that really two-way relationship, again, because of the power differential between you and the faculty member. It shouldn't be a fully two-way relationship. So this one's a maybe, but it's a maybe away from no. A relationship with the faculty member is probably not going to be interpersonal. And then your romantic relationship? Duh, please. I hope that's interpersonal. As we're communicating with others, we have these relational messages. And there's two kinds of major relational messages that we send: the content message and the relational message. So our content message is very simple. It's what we're saying to the person. And our relational message is what it says about our relationship. Let's say that you are talking to your partner about making sure that they lock the door at night because they've been forgetting to do that. Our content message might say, "Hey, Bob, please remember to lock the door before going to bed. Thanks." That relational message shows that I'm not mad at Bob. I respect Bob. I'm just asking Bob to do something differently. That's a simple, assertive language message using powerful language. But if I said, "Bob, lock the door," duh, I'm saying the same thing, same kind of content, but I'm applying a different relational message to it. I'm showing Bob that I don't really respect him, that I'm angry at him, maybe that I think he's an idiot for not locking the door. Whatever it is, that relational message says something about my relationship with Bob. So this is kind of that feedback, encoding, decoding that we talked about in that communication model at the beginning of the semester. Stuff like how you say something is just as much of the communication as the words that you're saying. There's other kinds of relational messages, and these kind of go together in pairs. So affinity is just how much you like somebody. Doesn't matter who, doesn't matter the context. Affinity is just, hey, you send a message that says, like, I really like this person. Respect is how you hold that person in high esteem. You might think, oh, wow, this person is really, really smart, and you might have a lot of respect for them. I went to a live show with one of my favorite podcast hosts last fall, and if you wore a shirt from the podcast, you got to get a picture taken with the podcast host. So I'm like, yes, I have the shirt. I'm going to wear the shirt. And when I met the podcast host, he was actually kind of off-putting, I guess. So I didn't have a lot of affinity for him necessarily, but I had a lot of respect because the things that he said on his podcast have really influenced me and changed the way that I approach certain areas of my life. Plus, I think the podcast is really funny. So there's that different affinity and respect. Immediacy is how much you want to interact with that person. So if you're at a party, this is the way I like to describe it. You're at a party and you see somebody and that person just makes you want to come up to them and chat. and you have a good conversation. They seem very bubbly, very friendly, very open, but also like somebody that you want to talk to. That's immediacy. And I did not feel that level of immediacy with the podcast host. He was just like, yep, I'm taking the pictures because you're all wearing the shirt. Agree with the shirt. But I didn't feel that immediacy. And then control is a degree of influence that you are exerting on the situation. And in my interactions with the podcast host, he exerted a lot of control. It was like, yep, here you go. Here's your picture. Next, next, next. Sending these messages of, okay, we're going to move this line along. And I know that he travels a lot and he's tired and he just wants to go to bed. And he even wasn't feeling that great that night. So I totally understand where I was getting these messages. But those are examples of those messages within that interaction. Now, you'll note that that was not an interpersonal interaction. I know a lot about the podcast host because on his podcast, he talks about himself and his experiences. And he talks a lot about his perspective on certain issues. So I feel like I know the podcast host pretty well. But the podcast host doesn't know anything about me. Doesn't even know my name. Doesn't know why I listen to his podcast or anything like that. So that's not an interpersonal relationship. But these aspects of interpersonal communication come into the way that I experience that interaction. Metacommunication is super important, and I want you to take a moment to really think about metacommunication as you listen to this slide and consider incorporating more of it into your life. Metacommunication is communication about the way that you are communicating. And it can be verbal or written or even nonverbal in various ways. Here's a great example. Last week, I was sitting on a Zoom call with my manager. It's just the two of us. It's our weekly one-to-one. We live in completely different states, and we've never met face-to-face. We are both working from our homes, which is generally what we do anyway, but especially now. We're sitting on this call. I'm talking about something, and all of a sudden, she gets this, oh, God, type look on her face. Which time she informed me that her dog had just let out a massive fart, and it was a big one. That kind of metacommunication really helped me understand what was going on there, because I'm talking about a project that I'm working on, and she is making the face of smelling a dog fart. Obviously, this dog is a couple thousand miles away. I have no way to know that the dog let out a fart, so I might see her look as being disgusted by the work that I'm doing on this project. Obviously, I would want to know if my boss is disgusted by the work I'm doing on a project for many reasons, and I would strongly prefer that she not communicate that disgust in the same way that she would react to a dog fart. Funnily enough, a couple minutes later into the call, I was drinking a mug of tea. The tea bag kind of opened up into my tea. I got some tea leaves in my face, and I kind of did one of these to something that she was saying, at which point I explained tea leaves. Metacommunication, this communication about communication, can help us understand each other better. And we do this a lot. I find that it's really helpful in organizational situations. One of the first things that I did when I started on a new team was ask my boss and the people I work with, hey, what's the best way to communicate with you? Do you use email? Do you use instant messenger? What's your expectation for how quickly I get back to you? And you do this with your friends too. With good friends or, even the person that I'm dating, we have conversations about the platforms that we prefer to use to communicate with each other. We had to agree, we're going to use Facebook Messenger as our primary forms of communication with each other, because there are so many other forms out there. I had a friend send me a text because she was concerned that I hadn't read her Snapchats. But I just bought a new phone and I cared so little about Snapchat that I forgot to download it. So that friend group and I had to renegotiate a new method of communication to basically address the fact that I forgot that Snapchat exists and didn't download it on my new phone. Metacommunication can also happen below the surface. So there might be some communication that you send non-verbally to a person that's communicating that you don't like the way that they're talking to you. Metacommunication can also be used to reinforce relationships. One thing that I find really helpful with students is if I give them some feedback or some suggestions and they say, yeah, that was really helpful, or it would be helpful if you did this instead. That meta-communication helps me understand how you're perceiving what I'm communicating with you and helps me communicate better with you and other students in the future. Sometimes it's also just nice to thank somebody for communicating with you in a certain way. So if I like the cute little note that my significant other left for me, I'm going to thank them for that. Metacommunication can also be risky because it can bring up things in our relationship that we're not quite ready to talk about, or it can make people think that we're mad when we're not. So if you want to talk to your friend or your roommate or a family member about kind of the tone that they're taking with you, they might really make that into a bigger deal than it needs to be. Metacommunication is a really valuable tool in our communication toolkit, and I think it's one that you should definitely keep in mind, especially for the professional workplace. Next, we'll move on to self-disclosure, and this is another one with a complicated definition, so pay close attention to all of these elements. Self-disclosure is deliberately revealing significant information about oneself that's not ordinarily known. Let's start at the beginning. Deliberately. Self-disclosure needs to be something that's deliberate. If somebody takes a screenshot of your private conversation and puts it out there on Twitter, that's not self-disclosure. That's somebody violating your privacy and being a jerk. Self-disclosure needs to be something that you reveal intentionally. It also has to be significant information. And significant information can really vary based on the context, but it has to be something that actually kind of matters to you. It has to be something about you and something that is not ordinarily known. So deliberate, significant, about you, not ordinarily known. All of these things together combine to form self-disclosure. Let's talk about some examples and some questions to ask yourself. When I talked about my boss's dog letting out a fart, that's a funny story. And it's not really something about me. It's not significant. Dog farts are funny, but they're not particularly meaningful. It's not something you would have ordinarily known, but really it's just kind of a funny anecdote. When you make some self-disclosure, you want to think about the following questions. So I'm going to talk about the self-disclosure that I chose to make when talking about changing my name in a couple of lectures ago. I thought about that decision a lot, and so I'm going to take that choice to self-disclose and apply it over here. First of all, if we think about the definition, it's something significant. It's something about me. It's something that you wouldn't ordinarily know. And it's definitely something that I chose to tell you. If you had encountered the old name or some other indication that I had changed it on the internet or somewhere else at Edgewood, that wouldn't be self-disclosure, but me telling you about it, telling you the story is. Here's how you can think through self-disclosure, and I'll apply the name change to these questions. First of all, is the other person important to you? Do you care about this person, or in my case, these people? And to me, yeah, I mean, students are important to me. That's why I do this. I don't do it for the money. I do get paid. But there are easier ways to earn money than this. So yeah, I mean, students are important to me. Is it appropriate? Well, this is one that I actually debated about. Is it appropriate for me to share this information with students? Is it weird? Is it too much? Is it uncomfortable? And I talked to a good friend of mine who is also a faculty member at a different institution, and I talked to the course director here before I decided that, yes, I was going to share this. And both of them thought, well, yeah, this is actually kind of a unique story to share with your class when talking about identity management. I was like, oh, well, okay, here we go. Check mark. Is the risk reasonable? So with self-disclosure, you're going to disclose something that's important to you, and that means that there is some risk. So I thought about what the risk was, and I thought it was fairly minimal. I didn't do anything that could possibly be construed as weird or offensive. Maybe there was a little risk in talking about my relationship with femininity, but Edgewood is a very open and accepting culture, so I didn't think that there was much of a risk, and I was like, cool, check. Is it reciprocated? So if you're going to self-disclose things to other people, generally you expect that they're going to just self-disclose something back to you. Remember that interpersonal communication is a two-way street. And yeah, you all disclose a lot of things, whether it's in class, in your journals, in your blogs. This class and Edgewood as a whole has a culture that supports self-disclosure. So me self-disclosing into that culture would be reciprocated. Is it constructive? Is the next one. So does this add to the conversation that we're having, or is it just, hey, everybody, look at me. I'm going to tell you about my story. Maybe a little bit of one-upmanship here. And I thought about that as well. Is it constructive? And I decided, yes. Telling this story helps illustrate this class concept, and it might help people who have seen or experienced something similar to this to feel heard. So I decided, yeah, this is constructive. Then, is it clear and understandable? We've all heard stories from people that are just rambling and confused, and you don't actually understand what they're trying to disclose to you about themselves. So I asked the question, how can I tell this story in a really organized way? And I struggle sometimes to tell people why I made this change. So before I recorded that video, I wrote out the order of the story, how I was going to tell it. I thought about some of the lines that I wanted to use, some of the witty things that I wanted to say, and I made sure that that self-disclosure was clear and understandable. You don't have to treat these questions like a checklist. And in fact, that would be a really boring conversation. Oh, hold on. I'm glad we're having this conversation about our feelings. Let me check my self-disclosure checklist. Please no. So you don't treat these like a checklist, but they're definitely things that you should consider and that people in general consider when deciding to make a self-disclosure. We are going to talk about two models for understanding self-disclosure. The first one is the social penetration theory. The second one is the Johari window. We'll talk about the social penetration theory here. Social penetration theory looks at us in this model of concentric circles. So I like to think of it as the onion. Those of you who have seen Shrek, onions have layers. Ogres have layers. So we're all ogres. Don't quote that out of context. But as we interact with people and we get to know them, we do this social penetration theory. On the surface here, We have stuff that is superficial about us, and we call that breadth. So this might mean that you know a lot of basic facts about a person. A person who knows me might know some basic facts that I love cats. I like dogs. Okay, I love dogs too. I'm just going to admit it. That I paddle, that I hike, I kayak, I lift weights, I teach, I work at a tech company, I live in Madison, all of these kind of basic breadth level things. The facts that you'd use to introduce yourself. These are the superficial facts. Intimate gets a little bit more deep in there. So this starts to tell more stories, more details, that kind of thing. Personal talks a little bit more about who we are as people, some perhaps difficult experiences that we've had, and the core really gets to the heart of who we are. What are those personal, deeply personal things that make you you? As you talk to people, you might have different levels here. So I have a friend, her name is Lily. We like to hike together. Lily knows a lot about how I feel about the outdoors. We've talked about our favorite outdoor activities. We, in fact, met doing an outdoor activity. We have talked about a lot of experiences and misadventures that we've had with outdoor activities. We've talked about our philosophy towards doing outdoor activities. And we've talked about how core outdoor activities are to who we are as people and what that means for our feelings about how we interact with ourselves, other people in the world at large. So things like gendered expectations in outdoor activities, or financial expectations in outdoor activities, like, oh, you got to spend all this money to be outdoorsy, or you have to look a certain way, and how bodies might impact that. So all that kind of stuff lives right here at the core, and our conversations with each other get into this wedge. So we cover all of these layers. But there are other areas of our lives where we don't go as deep. These might be different hobbies, our employment. We don't talk about work that much. So our work might look like, we'll talk about it a little bit, not too deeply. You're generally not going to be able to get into all of this, the entire social penetration model, with one person. That would be a really deep relationship. And even me, I think about my closest friend. This person has been a good friend of mine for 10 years. We tell each other a lot of things, but we're not going to get this deep on everything. That's a lot of territory to cover. So social penetration theory helps us put this kind of visual map to understanding our disclosures with another person. And if you want to practice this, and I recommend that you do this, get out a piece of paper, draw yourself some circles, and then map out where different disclosures fit between you and another person. So think about drawing a relationship with a friend or a family member. How deep do you go? What topics are you really deep on? What topics are you really shallow on? And then think about what that says about your relationship. Do you like what that says? Do you feel there are some topics that you should go deeper on? Or do you feel like, whoa, we went way too deep on this? And remember, communication is irreversible. Self-disclosure, form of communication, also irreversible. So think about how you feel about those theories and those models in that context. The Johari window helps us look at a combination of things that are known to ourselves, about ourselves, and things that others know about ourselves. Works in 4 windows. Our first quadrant here is the open quadrant. These are things that are known to others and known to yourself. So everybody knows whatever about you. So you might all know that I have brown hair. Woo! not really a disclosure because it's something you can tell by looking at me, but something that's pretty obvious. Hidden is something that you know about yourself, but is not known to others. This could be a lot of different things. Let's take a workplace example. You might know that you are applying for new jobs to get out of the workplace that you have, but you're not going to tell other people at work that information. Pro tip, if you are trying to leave your workplace, don't tell your boss and your coworkers that you're trying to leave. Don't leave until you're ready to go. They might push you out. So if I know that I hate my job and I am going home and I'm applying for new jobs every single night, that's something that's going to be hidden because it's something that I know about myself but isn't known to others. The blind quadrant is the opposite of that. So the blind quadrant is things that are known to others but not known to yourself. And you might think, well, how does that work? How do other people know things about me that I don't know about me? Well, guess what? I have another workplace example. When companies start to think about layoffs, and I know this is a scary thing to think about, they make their lists of who they're going to lay off, whether it's different departments, different offices, different groups of people, and they know that you are about to get laid off. A couple of years ago, I was working for a company that was based out of Austin and had an office in Madison. I worked our weekend shift. So I would take my weekend on Tuesday and Wednesday, and I would work the other 5 days of the week. Yes, it sucked. Moving on. The Sunday, Saturday, I was working. My manager's manager, my grand boss, got on Instant Messenger and asked me, hey, can you come in on Tuesday instead of taking your weekend that day? And then take your weekend the next 2 days. And I said, sure, yeah, I can come in on Tuesday. I have an appointment in the morning. I'll be in at 10 o'clock. Cool. So what I knew is that, I didn't know anything, actually. I figured, some people took Tuesday off. They need me to come in. Sure, whatever. I didn't think too hard about it. So I went to my hair appointment and I looked dope AF and came into the office. And I walk into the office and there is a person I don't recognize who is holding a stack of laptops with stickers on them that I do recognize. And she asks me, do you work here? And I look at her and I say, I think you have better data on that than I do at this point, because I could tell exactly what was going down. When my grand boss asked me to come in that Tuesday, he was asking me to come in because they were laying off the entire Madison office. He knew something about me that I didn't know about myself. Then we have this unknown quadrant, which is things that are not known to others and not known to yourself. So when my boss went and told me, you are going to be out of a job in 6 months, he didn't know how I was going to react to that, because that's something that wasn't known to self or wasn't known to me, because, I was not prepared for this situation. This can also be things that we're just simply working on discovering about ourselves, so that we learn about ourselves as we get older, grow, and have more experiences. So here we've got things that people know about you that you know about yourself, things you know about yourself, others don't, things that others know about you that you don't know about you, and then the unknown. Like the social penetration model, it can be really fun to sit down and diagram out a situation. Sometimes I find just diagramming out an interpersonal situation is really valuable. So you sit down, you diagram it out, and you might think about where those facts are and what quadrant they fall into and how that influences the way that you self-disclose and operate in those interpersonal relationships. Finally, I'm going to talk a little bit about the communication climate, which is this thing that has an overarching effect on our interpersonal relationships. A communication climate is the emotional tone of a relationship. That can be overall positive, overall negative. Every organization has a communication climate. All of your classes have a communication climate. Your workplace has a communication climate. Your family, your friends, there is a communication climate there that addresses the emotional tone of the relationship. When we're developing a communication climate, we create it in one of two ways. And sometimes you'll see these in a combination. But you've got disconfirming messages and confirming messages. A disconfirming message is anything that denies the value of other people. So this could be something like turning away from a person as they're talking to you, or sitting there scrolling through your phone, not really listening. It's showing people that they don't matter. Perhaps the biggest disconfirming message is just ignoring somebody. Not responding to a person just shows not only do you not matter, but I don't really even think you exist. Then you have confirming messages, and these are things that show people that they're valued. This can be metacommunication, or it can be doing nice things for people, or even a facial expression. One way that we saw a lot of confirming messages earlier in the semester is people writing nice things in the chat after other students finish their speech. That's a confirming message. It shows that student giving their speech that they were really valued in the class, and we appreciated their contributions. A spiral is a reciprocating communication pattern. So you and the other person in that relationship reinforce each other's messages. An escalatory conflict spiral is where we have conflict that just keeps escalating because nobody wants to back down. So one attack leads to another, leads to another, leads to another, and you can't let the other person win. If this looks like American politics to you, you've nailed it. We can't admit that the other person might have a point, and any sort of backing down makes it feel like we're losing. In contrast, we have the avoidance spiral, which is where we withdraw from the relationship and from the conflict. And this means that issues don't get talked about. So let's say that there's an issue that you are avoiding between you and your significant other. It might be something about physical affection. You don't feel like you're getting enough physical affection from your partner, but as you try to talk to them about it, they shut it down. So you get the message that you're not going to be able to talk about this issue with physical affection. And you start to withdraw from the relationship, and from that conflict, they start to withdraw, and then you both feel like you can't bring it up, and it just becomes this elephant in the room. An avoidance spiral is just as bad as an escalatory conflict spiral in this situation, because not having the conflict means that you're not having the conversation about the problem. And we tend to reciprocate the other person's communication patterns. If I'm sending out a message that, no, we're not going to talk about this topic, and my partner's sending out the same message, we're going to reinforce each other. With that, that's your overview of interpersonal communication. And that's just a little tiny bit of the discipline. If you're interested, there are interpersonal communication classes that you can take in the Comm Studies department that'll really get into this stuff in more depth and detail. But my job here is really to just give you that little taste, that little overview to help you improve your interpersonal and non-interpersonal relationships.
Today's pet cameo comes from Mo, who is a sad, wet dog after getting a bath. Luckily, he did get a puppy cannoli on the way home for being such a good boy. Thanks for listening to the lecture. We'll see you next week.